Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever in the world you are. I'm 𝗦𝗂𝗀𝗶𝘀𝗵𝗲𝗿, Senior Social Development Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. Welcome to our event to mark the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia 2021. Sorry, I don't think the video was working for a sec. Anyway, thank you all for joining. We have not one, but two excellent panels where we will delve into the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the lives of marginalized sexual and gender minorities. We are also very pleased to have 𝗧𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗏𝗀 join us from the World Bank to demonstrate our excellent collaboration in the field of 𝗧cie, or sexual orientation and gender identity inclusion. Just a couple of quick reminders before we start. Please keep your mics on mute and turn your videos off. Please put your questions in the chat so that we have these for the Q&A. We will try and ask a varied selection of questions from those submitted. Without further ado, I would like to ask Bruno Carrasco, Director General of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at ADB, to deliver opening remarks. Bruno leads ADB-wide knowledge and innovation work in all thematic and sector operation areas, establishes sector and thematic policies and strategies, and ensures compliance with environment and social safeguard policies. Over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for that introduction. A very good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are. We at ADB are delighted to be hosting this event for the third year in succession for the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, or IDAHOTB. Marking this day emphasizes the importance of sexual orientation and gender identity, or 𝗧cie, inclusion and non-discrimination. In a minute, you will hear from 𝗧𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗏𝗃, the Global Director for Social Sustainability and Inclusion at the World Bank. We are especially delighted that she is joining us at the collaboration in this area. As the collaboration in this area has been very strong. We are now working together on joint research on such things as legal barriers to 𝗧cie inclusion, which ADB is leading for the Asia Pacific region. It is indeed exciting to see this sort of collaboration between the multilateral development banks in this new and important area of work. We certainly value our partnerships, and together we can share knowledge, as we're doing today, to understand the multiple and intersecting levels of exclusion faced by people and communities across our region and, in fact, the entire world. For ADB, our 𝗧cie inclusion work is really rooted within our medium-term strategy, or Strategy 2030, in which our operational priority 1 is about eliminating remaining poverty and reducing inequalities. Within this priority, there's a pillar on inclusion, and we at ADB recognize the multiple intersecting elements of potential exclusion which need to be addressed if we are indeed to achieve a truly inclusive region. Of course, for the second year at IDAHOTB, we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic that is now not new, of course, but that the region and wider world still face immense challenges in overcoming. ADB is doing its part to support our developing member countries, including providing loans and technical assistance to support vaccine rollout through the Asia Pacific Vaccine Access Facility. And this follows on our COVID-19 pandemic recovery operations last year. On this note, we hope all of you are staying safe in these difficult times. At today's event, we are honored to host 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃, a former World Bank Chief Economist and former Chief Economic Advisor to India's Ministry of Finance, as well as 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃, a leading thinker on the economic and social costs of LGBTQI exclusion. They will provide a baseline on the types of discrimination faced by sexual and gender minorities and their impact both on individuals and the whole economy, even before the pandemic began. We're also really looking forward to welcoming a panel of LGBTQI civil society representatives including those specifically representing the transgender and youth communities who can sometimes face additional marginalization and denial of a meaningful voice. They will talk about real lived experiences during the pandemic based on primary research of what is going on in their communities on the ground. Finally, I would like to extend a special welcome to our audience, both inside and outside ADB. Through this work, we are forming increasingly close bonds with LGBTQI, civil societies, and others working in the field of 𝗧cie inclusion research in academia. We welcome you all and look forward to a rich and great discussion that complements our work to create a more inclusive Asia and the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for setting the scene. We will now hear from 𝗧𝗲𝗀𝗃𝗏𝗏, the World Bank's Global Director, Social Sustainability and Inclusion. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 has many years of experience managing World Bank operations across Africa and Latin America, as well as managing their poverty global practice. Let's hear from 𝗧𝗏𝗏.
Thank you, Bruno, for your remarks, and hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. I myself am honored to be here to mark IDAHOTB together with other international financial institutions and our partners from the Asian Development Bank. This year's annual commemoration gives us an opportunity to renew our focus on sexual and gender minorities who have been so disproportionately impacted by the ongoing pandemic. This year's global theme, Together, Resisting, Supporting, and Healing, is very relevant as it speaks to the work and the challenges ahead. Discrimination and exclusion based on a person's sexual orientation and gender identity comes at high cost to people and economies. Even before the pandemic, we know that LGBTI people were likely overrepresented amongst the poor. And we can assume that the massive job losses and labor market disruptions due to COVID-19 have pushed even more LGBTI people into poverty. We also know from available data that sexual and gender minorities often face discrimination and barriers in accessing health services. And in the context of COVID-19, these barriers can lead to exclusion and make it difficult for LGBTI people to receive the healthcare services that they need. For example, as vaccine rollouts increase in many parts of the world, the evidence of discrimination in health services suggests that many LGBTI people may be hesitant to become vaccinated themselves. We also know from research that there's widespread discrimination and stigma against LGBTI people is linked to mental health challenges. We've seen rates of depression and particularly suicide higher amongst LGBTI people than the general population. This is especially true amongst youth, and the pandemic has likely worsened these existing mental health issues. The situation can be particularly difficult for LGBTI people who lack access to professional help, or who may be quarantined with unsupportive or even abusive family members and cohabitants. Many sexual and gender minorities have lost the ability to keep the close ties to community organizations that they rely on to receive these essential services such as psychosocial support, HIV testing, and medication. We at the World Bank recognize that data is essential in the fight against COVID-19, the same way that it is essential in the fight against poverty and discrimination. More than a year into the pandemic, we still have very limited information on the specific risks and impacts LGBTI people face due to COVID-19, including the lack of robust data on their needs and challenges that LGBTI people face in accessing vaccines. There is a clear need to understand the unique impact of the coronavirus on sexual and gender minorities. For example, before the pandemic, World Bank study found in Thailand that LGBTI people faced persistent discrimination in accessing essential government health services, including access to health care. Half of the LGBTI respondents in a 2018 Thai survey reported being treated disrespectfully when seeking government services, and more than 30% were harassed or ridiculed and faced differential requirements to access those services. Almost a quarter of LGBTI respondents said that they were asked to leave healthcare facilities because of their 𝗧cie status. Now, more than ever, we need to tackle these challenges and address the discrimination that LGBTI people face in accessing services and in having trust in public institutions. Working alongside other international financial institutions, the World Bank is committed to expanding the evidence base on 𝗧cie exclusion. Specifically, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank are moving ahead on research to identify the legal, regulatory, and policy constraints that LGBTI people face in accessing critical services and government support. I look forward to learning from today's panelists on what we as multilateral institutions can do more working with the development community to promote inclusion of LGBTI people and development that benefits all. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Louise, for drawing our attention to the very real issues affecting many LGBTQI people during the pandemic. It was great to hear from both Bruno and Louise of the importance of cross-MDB collaboration on 𝗧cie inclusion. The joint research they both mentioned on legal barriers is just about to get started, and we have a great team of researchers on board. We hope that the findings of this study will have a meaningful influence in our work in achieving an inclusive Asia and the Pacific, where there is no place for exclusion or discrimination. We are now privileged to hear from two highly eminent economists and thinkers on the economics of 𝗧cie inclusion. 𝗧𝗲𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is best known for her research into economic issues affecting LGBTQI people and the impacts on whole economies. Amongst many achievements, she has exposed the myth that sexual and gender minorities are more affluent than heterosexual people, and also quantified the effects of marriage inequality. 𝗦𝗂𝗶𝗶𝗁𝗂𝗏 is C. Marks Professor of International Studies and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. He was previously Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, following which he became Chief Economist of the World Bank. Lee and 𝗏𝗂𝗫 will be introduced by Fabrice Boudard, a person who has done much to put 𝗧cie inclusion onto the agenda of the MDBs. Over to you, Fabrice, Lee, and 𝗏𝗂𝗫.
Welcome to the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia event organized by the Asian Development Bank. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome two of the most prominent economists when it comes to the question of development economics and LGBTQ+ inclusion. So first, I'll start by introducing my very good friend, 𝗲𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Lee is an economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she's very well known for her research into economics issues relevant to LGBTQ+ individuals and families. In fact, she just came out this year with a great book, The Economic Case for LGBT Equality, which has been a focal point for our thinking around those issues. So Lee, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. And then I have 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, a former colleague of mine from the World Bank. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is an Indian economist who was chief economist of the World Bank from 2012 to 2016. And he is now the C. Marks Professor of International Studies and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. Thank you so much for joining us, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. It's a great privilege to have you. So unfortunately, this is kind of a short conversation. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump into it extremely quickly. And so Lee, you played a key role in articulating the economic and business case against discrimination against LGBTQ+ people. To the point you did such a good job that now it feels a little bit like, why did we need to say in the first place that discrimination is bad for the economy. So could you tell us what was the journey in your career that led you to do this, to take this task on, but also which myths you had to dispel along the way?
Well, that's a great question, because it's not traditionally the way that we think about LGBTI issues. We usually think about them as being relevant to the questions of human rights, and of course they are. LGBTI people have the same human rights as other people do. But when these topics come up in debates in public, on public issues, as they have in the US, or in development banks, or finance ministries, and different kinds of, or in boardrooms, frankly, the human rights argument does not seem to carry the weight that we might want it to have, frankly. And so the question becomes, what are some other good reasons for ensuring LGBTI people's equality and access to human rights? And for a couple of decades here in the US, I was taking on these issues of public policy related to non-discrimination and questions about families. And what I found was that sometimes the way into having a conversation with people was to approach it somewhat from the side, to not go directly to the human rights kind of argument, but to say, well, have you thought about the fact that if you don't treat LGBTI people the same way as your heterosexual employees, that you might actually be more likely to lose those employees, or you might be more likely to have employees who cannot work to their full capacity. And having those kinds of conversations was a way to talk about the interests that were more right in front of decision makers in the business world, for example, and sometimes in front of decision makers in the public policy arena. So those questions, talking about them in a new way, opened up new audiences, especially in worlds connected to financial questions. So, along the way, people have ideas about LGBTI people and what their lives are like, and sometimes they are just simply wrong. They're based on stereotypes, stereotypes that LGBTI people are very creative and kind of a global elite, which is easily debunked by looking at data on economic inequality for LGBTI people. Or some people still think that maybe LGBTI people have a mental illness. And again, that's been debunked by all the world's health authorities. And then another one, in some parts of the world, there's a belief that homosexuality is a Western import, that it's not, something that happens naturally all over the world in every culture. And yet we have exactly that kind of evidence that it is something that's not a Western import. It's something it's part of natural human life and human sexuality. So sometimes, again, going at those questions really directly aren't going to get you as far as, kind of easing in terms of talking about other kinds of issues that seem a little bit more comfortable on more familiar territory for certain kinds of people.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. And you do mention that one of the myths you had to tackle was the idea that this is a Western import. And so, 𝗏𝗃𝗃, you're one of the most prominent economists in India, and that's what you're known for. But besides that, very early on, you actually denounce Section 377, which is a section of the penal code in many countries in South Asia, but also other parts of the world, that criminalize same-sex relationship. And so, my question to you is, why would you decide to take on such a section of the penal code?
Brice, thank you. For me, this was never really a conscious decision. I sort of stumbled into it by writing a newspaper op-ed, because to me it seemed the discrimination is unnatural, is what it seemed to me. that you really, human beings are different. I prefer red, you prefer green, and that's the way you should treat it. And I took up a position against the Indian Penal Code 377. And I cannot for a moment claim it was central. It was also when I became the chief economic advisor to the Indian government, meetings right at the top. In between inflation and growth and the conventional topics, I would occasionally slip in that India needs to act on this and get rid of the Penal Code 377. One thing which, as Lee was speaking, it struck me, and an argument I had made, is far from this being homosexuality being an import from the West. It's the ban on that, the Indian Penal Code, contrary to what lots of people thought, was actually an import from the West. In India, it was an 1861 law brought in by the British into India. So the ban was brought in, and then I did a little bit of strategic play, appeal to nationalism, that this was an import of colonialism, the law against it. So far from sort of saying that we will live to our own tradition historically was not this. And it had some effect. I mean, in 2009, it's putting too much to myself. There was a lot of people devoting a lot of time. I would write an occasional column and make cases in meetings. But the Delhi High Court made a first move in 2009. It got revoked. And they said that Penal Code 377 is wrong. But the Supreme Court overruled that in 2013. And these things take time. But by 2018, it was off. The Supreme Court again took a position that India ought to get rid of it. And, you know, Britain, which had brought in this law, had got rid of it in 1961. So India just lived with the colonial heritage longer than that. But that's just the law. The law influences mindsets. The discrimination is rampant. So Fabrice, like in the World Bank, when you organized the meeting, and I met people who had come from India, they are traditionally known as hijras, and they are marginalized. For me, it was very touching because this was the first time sitting in Washington that I got to interact with them, hear their story in detail. And to me, it's revolting, the treatment that is meted out. The law has changed, but a great distance still to go.
Well, I love it, the point you make, 𝗏𝗃𝗃, that it is not homosexuality or non-conforming gender identity that is a Western import. It is discrimination, which is, a great point. So Lee, it's an Asian Development Bank event. And so, we can imagine that we have a lot of development practitioners in the room, hopefully. So your framework kind of shows the different pathways in which discrimination gets in the way of the development outcomes of this specific population. So could you kind of summarize to us what are those pathways, but also why development practitioners should pay attention to discrimination?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really the core question. I would say that many development programs are focusing on education, on health, on livelihoods, improving people's access to good jobs and higher incomes. And I think all of those goals are going to be harder to reach and maybe impossible to reach for LGBTI people, but they'll be harder to reach because of the treatment that people face in schools, in the workplace, when it comes to getting health services, or when it comes to needing them in the first place. So in the education field, we have evidence from many different countries, a growing number of countries, that shows that that LGBTI young people face bullying and discrimination in schools that hurts their ability to stay in school. They're more likely to drop out. They don't do as well in school. And they're less likely to continue on. And these are all problems that will hold back people's capacity. In economics, we call it human capital. It's going to diminish the human capital that they have to go out and contribute and participate in the economy. Actually, all of those, that kind of bullying is something that also hurts other people in the school. There's a fair amount of evidence now that suggests that schools where much bullying takes place are also worse learning environments for everyone, not just for the LGBTI people who are involved. From the perspective of employment, we know that there's discrimination. It's a great study actually in Asia that looked at the opportunities available to transgender people in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And they sent out resumes for transgender people that talked about their prior names and other indicators that they were transgender, and compared them to resumes of cisgender people, that is people who are not transgender. And what they found was in all 4 of those countries that the transgender people were much less likely to be invited to an interview by an employer, even though they had exactly the same qualifications as those other non-transgender people, those cisgender people who were applying. So this is a headwind that makes it very hard for LGBTI people to get jobs. And again, there are studies in many different countries in Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, China, that show that discrimination is very common against LGBTI people in the workplace. Now that's a problem for them, and it's a problem for them in terms of making a living, but it also means that employers themselves are not using the resources of the economy efficiently if they're discriminating and not hiring people who are qualified, well qualified for jobs. So that's a big problem on at least 2 levels, the individual level, but also kind of the larger level about how well the economy is functioning, again, for everyone. And then finally, this kind of treatment is very bad for people's health, for their mental health and for their physical health. And we have studies, again, from all over the world that show that LGBTI people face this kind of minority stress related to discrimination that may lead them to expect discrimination and try to prevent it by hiding who they are, by doing things that tap their cognitive energy, and also are going to be more likely to make them sick. So we see, higher rates of anxiety and depression, of suicide attempts, of violence, of HIV infections for LGBTI people all over the world. So this is again kind of taking people out of the workforce. And as you know, a couple of times I've tried to add up what these effects might look like. How many people have we lost because of this kind of treatment? And even just looking at a few aspects of how people, of the kind of disparities that people face, adds up to quite a bit. In India, it came close to around 1% of GDP. I did a similar kind of exercise in the Philippines, and it was somewhere around 0.5 percentage point of GDP, with just actually the bare minimum of health disparities and economic disparities included there. So it at least gives us a sense that it's not a small number. It's a meaningful, potentially a meaningful hit to the economy that is going to hold back development bank goals at that high level as well. So it really kind of, it starts at the bottom, but it adds up at the end of the day, and it means that everyone's efforts will be less successful because of LGBTI people's exclusion.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Lee. And I think also what is very powerful in a lot of those different estimates that you made is that you show the ripple effect that go beyond the community, and that it tends to affect people, as you say, it can affect, cisgender people in school that are basically the bystanders in this discrimination. And so you show those ripple effects that eventually amount to a pretty big self-inflicted economic wound. So 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏, in her book, Lee mentions you, and she talks about a moment which I love, which is that one day we are having this meeting at the World Bank. I think it was with Philip Alston, who was the independent expert on poverty. And you were very kindly joining to show that the Office of the Chief Economist was interested in those issues, that they were not frivolous issues, but that they were development issues. And you said something, you took the floor at some point, and you said something which we would not have expected from the chief economist. You said, we have to be careful not to frame everything in terms of GDP loss, because the human rights argument, I mean, I don't know if you use the word human rights, but you said, the human argument is enough in itself to justify ending discrimination against LGBTI people. So could you go back to that moment and explain to us what is the motivation for an economist to say not everything is about GDP?
Yeah, so it is maybe from my profession, the sensitivity that we tend to pose these in terms of GDP. At times it's right, and I want to emphasize that though I've corresponded with Lee subsequently on this, I think the point being made is right. But I would make, in fact, an additional point that even if it did not contribute to GDP, there are certain basic rights which should be treated as fundamental. I mean, whether or not slavery contributed to America's growth, to me, is unimportant in deciding that slavery is bad. It's an additional argument. And in fact, I should say from Lee's book, it becomes very clear that there is a loss of GDP. One analogy which Lee did not mention here, which I thought was lovely in the book, is to talk about the orchestra, where in the orchestra, if there are some people being discriminated against, deflated, and doing their job, playing their instrument poorly, it's not just that their bit of the music you lose, you're affecting the entire orchestra. So there is interaction. A GDP is a complex creation. And if a segment of the society is dispirited, psychologically damaged, it's other people who are being affected also. So I take that point. But I keep feeling that we must each time add on the additional point that even if it did not, there are certain things you do as ends in themselves. And basic human rights is in that category. And now today, India has revoked the law. But as you know, there are countries across the world. I was doing a count, I think 71 countries have similar laws. A lot in Africa, Asia, there's Malaysia, Indonesia, there are countries which have this. I would go there and yes, I know that people do here as soon as you say you're losing GDP. And since that is also a fact, I would point to that. But at some point, we have to recognize that there are certain things which go beyond GDP. And that's what I was stressing. And I would like to continue to do that.
Well, you know, unfortunately, I see there's a little timer on the top of my screen, and I see we're coming at the end of our time. But you know, I'm delighted that I was able to moderate this discussion, particularly because I do believe that having economists and development practitioners in the room that said, you know, it is not an issue of culture, it is not an issue of being nice to people, it is an issue of human rights, it is an issue of economic interest. You know, it kind of helped for the topic to graduate from a topic that sometimes macroeconomists saw as being frivolous to a topic that now a lot of financial institutions are considering part of their work. And so for this, you know, on behalf of the LGBTQ community, if I can speak on their behalf, thank you. And I hope, you know, we get to have more of this discussion. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great to hear such a powerful case for non-discrimination from multiple perspectives. It was also good to hear that we are making some progress, both in terms of the argument and the situation on the ground, including in our region, even if there's still a long way to go. This creates a really helpful baseline for understanding the economic and social issues relating to discrimination on the basis of 𝗧cie, even before the pandemic hit. We will now take a deep dive into the issues arising from the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all been living through. Our panel have all either led or advised on research into the effects of the pandemic and related policies on specific communities. I'll now introduce our three panelists. Selvan Anthony is from APCOM, the Pan-Asia Pacific LGBTQI rights organization. He has led APCOM's initiative to collect data and support SGM communities across the region with challenges they have faced from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have Rain Cortez. She's from the Asia Pacific Transgender Network and oversees health and rights related projects for the network, also supporting their study on the effects of the pandemic on trans communities. And last but not least, we have Rayanne Librado, board chairperson of Youth Voices Count, the organization representing LGBTQI youth in Asia and the Pacific. YBC have investigated the specific issues affecting queer youth during the pandemic and also provided support through grants to grassroots organizations across the region. Selvan, Rain, and Rayan, thank you all so much for taking the time to give us the benefit of what you have learned about the pandemic and its effects. I'll ask each of you to speak for about 5 minutes on the data and stories your organizations have been able to collect, how you went about the data collection, and what you found out about people's ability to provide for themselves and access services. So over to you, first of all, Selvan.
Thanks so much, Oliver, for this wonderful presentation, and thanks so much to ADB and team for giving us an opportunity to talk in this panel. So I would like to start by saying that APCOM has conducted the COVID-19 survey for 11 countries in the Asia and Pacific region last year. These countries include Cambodia, India, Indonesia, 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗏, Mongolia, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and India. So the survey was conducted in 2020, as I said, to understand the effects of COVID-19 on LGBTQI organizations and communities in the region. If I talk about the COVID-19 effect on LGBTQ organization, here the survey key findings says that the COVID-19 has caused suspension of all physical activities of LGBTQI organizations at the country level. Face-to-face meetings were suspended. All the staff in the LGBTQ organization started to work from home without proper internet facilities or technologies. That's really so terrible. Also, all the organization activities moved to online events, and organizations were struggling to identify alternative ways to deliver the programs and the services. The COVID-19 crisis not only affected the staff knowledge transfer, but also it affected the operational and fundraising at the country level. The report key findings discuss that most of the organizations in the region started to support ground-level LGBTQ communities with high essentials. Many of them started using their funders' money to support the LGBTQ communities with food, water, shelter, and some sanitary needs. The story doesn't end here. It also affects LGBTQ individuals at the country level. The key findings reveals that the COVID has added an additional layer to their existing challenges. The findings also says that the LGBTQ communities who served for entertainment had left with no jobs because of closures due to COVID-19 pandemic crisis. These individuals not being able to earn income, which put them into trouble in accessing essentials, as I said, which is food, shelter, water, and utilities. This resulted them to rely on government and community-based organizations for this support. The report also revealed that many LGBTQ individuals could not able to access health services, including HIV and ARV services, because of the closure of community-based organizations and health centers in their countries. Besides the regional survey, APCOM did also roll out an online survey in Thailand for the local communities in Thailand. The survey reached out to sex workers, people who inject drugs, people living with HIV, people who are at high risk of contracting STI, members of the LGBTQ communities, refugees, and migrants. Almost this survey reached out to 1,430 respondents in Thailand. The key finding says that almost 18% respondents got displaced from their own regional locations, and 13% of the respondents have to move out permanently. Just to highlight, majority of the respondents who attempted this survey are PLHIV, which is almost 838. Some of the PLHIV respondents said that they were not able to access necessary treatment because of the COVID-19 crisis in Thailand. We also asked about the mental health status. Most of them said that their mental health status was terribly affected. They were feeling anxious, sad, and depressed, most time because of the no jobs A few of the respondents said that they were also asked to do long hours at their workplaces. This clearly indicates that their human rights have been violated, and almost 41 respondents said that they face domestic violence. In summary, I would say that all the report what we have done has disclosed that COVID-19 crisis has brought a significant impact on the rights, health, and well-being of the communities in Thailand and in the region. The story doesn't end here. A few other organizations in the region also conducted COVID-19 survey in the mid of a COVID-19 survey. You might be knowing an organization, Marriage for All Japan, a gender incorporated association that works towards the realization of same-sex marriage, conducted an online survey on anxieties and difficulties faced by sexual minorities due to COVID-19 effect. The survey was responded by 236 participants from the LGBTQ communities, out of which 87 respondents said that I am worried whether I can be contacted in an emergency or treated as family. The survey key findings show fear and worries amongst the LGBTIQ communities. On 14 May 2020, the support groups in Hong Kong submitted a request to the government urging them to respond in a manner that protects the LGBTIQ rights, that doesn't discriminate against sexual minorities in the field of emergency, medical care, and in the administrative support systems. Beside all these surveys, Sexualities Research Program at the Chinese University of Hong Kong conducted a survey for LGBTQ communities in Hong Kong to cover the effect of COVID-19 on sexual minorities on their mental health. The survey almost reached out to 857 respondents who are from LGBT communities. The key findings also revealed that more than half, that is 63% of the LGBT people, has average to high level of worries about their health. Around 15% of them indicated that their health condition had been significantly affected because of the COVID-19 crisis. More than half of the respondents reported that they experienced high worries because of their financial situation. Around half of the respondents indicated that the daily routine had often or always been disrupted. In short, this report also revealed that the COVID-19 has affected the health and well-being of the LGBT communities in Hong Kong. The story again doesn't stop here. APCOM also reached out to the LGBTQI individuals to gather individual stories in the middle of COVID-19. We reached out to many individuals, but the one inspiring stories I would like to say, a 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗏𝗏 community person from Indonesia had said that COVID has added an additional layer to the existing challenges. It caused a challenge to access anti-ARV treatment in some areas. The lockdown has affected the import of ARV from other countries. He further said that he lost his job because of COVID-19 crisis and moved to his hometown. The COVID cases in Indonesia keep rising every day, and it makes him feel worried, and it affected his mental health. He started doing online consultation with mental health professionals. If you see, all this report had revealed that the COVID has a very serious effect on LGBTQ rights, health, and well-being of the LGBTQ individuals in the Asia and Pacific region. However, to assist LGBTQ communities during the pandemic crisis, APCOM had started a similar small project, which is called as Corona Compassion Project. Here, APCOM actually welcomes its staff to donate some part of their salary every month to support the LGBTQ communities to buy essentials amid of COVID-19 pandemic. APCOM, through this project, provided fund to organizations in Indonesia, Fiji, Myanmar, Pakistan, India, Cambodia. APCOM will continue to support communities and LGBTQ organizations through this project to help them buy essentials in the middle of COVID-19. And the story doesn't stop here. Besides this, as part of APCOM's advocacy initiatives, APCOM also submitted an open letter to WHO to integrate the effects of COVID-19 on the LGBTQ communities and got a positive response from WHO General. So these are all the things which I would like to talk about what APCOM has done in the last year. And I would like to end by saying that we need support from stakeholders to support our communities in the mid of COVID-19. Thank you so much for all your support, and leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selvin, for those really quite shocking and serious findings of all your research. It's incredible the amount of, or the ability you've had to be able to reach so many different people across the region, even in the midst of this crisis with the restrictions we've all been under. I mean, some of the findings were very serious indeed, such as people being displaced from their homes, of course, the lack of treatments, especially with HIV. So thank you so much for taking us through all of that. Okay, so next we're going to hear from Rain with a specific focus on the trans community. Over to you, Rain.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Of course, in behalf of the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, I would like to acknowledge first our program officer, Cole Young, who is unable to join us today, but he served as our focal point for the COVID-19 Community Support Fund that we have been implementing. The Asia Pacific Transgender Network has been working since last year in response and monitoring the effects of COVID-19 to trans and gender non-conforming communities that we serve in the Asia and the Pacific region. We did release a COVID-19 community survey and rapid assessment at that time when the pandemic was starting. And the information coming from this survey actually informed us to develop our COVID-19 framework, which revolves around factors and key areas on advocacy, leadership building, health, strategic information, and relief support to partners and communities. And the biggest chunk or portfolio that we were working on during the time of the pandemic was our relief support, which was established through our community support fund, which we were able to reprogram and to rechannel existing project funding of around $110,000 US and was able to distribute it to 22 community-based organizations who are trans-led and trans-inclusive community-based organizations in 14 different countries. Majority are in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and in the Pacific. These funds were, of course, used to provide food, rations, PPEs, healthcare, rent, hormones, and some of it were able to support organizations to continue operating as well. And as part of our grant, we implemented a community-led monitoring of the COVID situation and the impacts of trans communities, including quantitative and qualitative data. We maximized the use of online platforms, free toolbox, such as the Kobo Toolbox, to be able to actually gather information and the experiences and lived realities of our communities during COVID-19. While the numbers are actually important and valuable, the insights coming from stories on the streets of the communities that we were dealing with actually provided us nuanced insights that the human rights violations and experiences as well during the pandemic of trans individuals. All of this are actually shown in our Trans Resilience Report, which you can actually see on our website, to share the findings, stories, and experiences of trans communities. It had a total of respondents of 2,313, wherein 92% of our beneficiaries were trans individuals, and 33%, it's interestingly, trans people are heads of their respective families. It means that the effect of the COVID-19, especially in financial security, to families who are with trans individuals, who is the breadwinner, is actually very drastic in terms of the effect to their respective families. The COVID-19 impacts highlighted in our report covers different factors. For example, in healthcare, many of their countries, like in Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, that healthcare for trans people become less of a priority because of the refocusing to COVID-19 interventions, and not many are able to go to the hospitals or make appointments or to start or even continue gender-affirming hormone therapy, which is very much needed at this time. Some countries are also no longer able to import hormones due to supply chain disruptions, as for the example of Sri Lanka and Nepal. And some gender-affirming surgeries are even canceled and postponed, which is actually an experience of my colleague Cole, who needed to find other options to seek gender-affirming care at this time. Our partners in India also reported, for example, for trans women having tested for positive for COVID-19, were actually situated into male quarantine centers, or even were not admitted at all. In terms of mental health care, a lot of our communities have felt anxiety and depression as a result of COVID-19. Increased mental health issues due to isolation, being cut off from supportive communities, or being stuck even in unaccepting homes. Such as situations shared to us by our partners in Southeast Asia. Specifically, our partners in Nepal reported multiple cases of suicide, including 2 trans men and 2 lesbian women, due to the violence while staying in their unsupportive homes. Our partner organizations are actually stepping up to provide peer-based support, which, while incredible and so needed, it is also draining to them and leads to their burnout as activists and volunteers to actually provide peer support to other people as well. And as we know, financial security is the biggest impact of COVID-19, especially on the trans community in all the countries. Trans people are often excluded from formal economy, and a lot has been engaged in sex work, bar workers, and even informal sectors. And because of COVID, they are unable to work in tourism, events, beauty, and sex work. Even our colleagues in the Pacific, even though the cases in the Pacific of COVID are not as high compared to the Asian region, because a lot of them are involved in tourism, this has actually affected their livelihood as well. Almost 81% of our respondents have reported reduced income, job loss, and were forced to go on unpaid leaves. And trans people are being excluded or receiving relief rations or government aids due to the lack of legal gender recognition or appropriate documentation to present their present gender identity. And 11% was not able to access social protection benefits in majority of the countries. This remains to highlight human rights violations among our communities, as example that was explained or shared by the Filipino communities that we serve, that given that restrictions were situated to local government units, and it was very unclear, and there were situations wherein trans community and the larger LGBT community were scrutinized for not following curfew, and were being harassed and humiliated in certain cities that were reported. And even in Malaysia, for example, and in Fiji, wherein trans sex workers and those rendered homeless due to the lack of the financial security were being arrested by the police and then segregated into shelters that are not appropriate to their gender identity. This actually highlights, especially for our community, that the economic situation of many of our trans sisters and brothers, especially in this region, are struggling. And sooner or later, they will surely end up homeless, hungry, and financial loss, depression, and anxiety because of the inaccess to government aid. And that is needed to be addressed. So despite this lockdown and travel restrictions and other barriers, our partner organizations have been stepping up to provide vital support to the respective communities. And despite these stories of hope, pain, and survival, this indeed truly highlights the resilience of the trans communities that we're serving here in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rain. Another, really amazing account of what's going on. Also great to see how much data you've managed to collect, how many people you've managed to talk to. Of course, trans people can be really on the margins of society, and some of the problems that some of your constituents have faced, very serious indeed. And of course, the reduction in gender affirming care, even for people who are relatively affluent, is something to give us pause for thought as well. Finally, last but not least, over to Rayanne to hear the view on the situation with the youth during the pandemic. Please, Rayanne.
Thank you, Oliver. In commemoration of the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia 2021, we join our friends from the ADB in its first joint multilateral development bank collaboration. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the banks for this effort. Good afternoon once again to Director General Bruno Carazo, Senior Vice President of Professor Lee Badgett, Director Bruce Dunn, and to my fellow panelists, Salvan and Rain from APCOM and APTN. The effort to come up with the regional report capturing the situations of young LGBTs at the time of the global pandemic is not only apt and relevant, but in itself historical in documenting our lived experiences, in organizing young LGBTs of the Asia Pacific at the time where nations are at a race to produce vaccines for each of their countries. This is the first pandemic, after all, that will be captured by the digital spaces. And we are particularly placed also at the time wherein also prior to the pandemic, where young LGBTs of our generation captures the center stage of an increasing and considerable political movement based on gendered identity after the earlier waves of the feminist and the women's movement globally. Identities such as people that are usually excluded in the greater frame of development, rendered invisible in today's trickling pandemic support. Through the help of the regional survey that we partnered with the UNICEF East Asia and the Pacific, Youth Voices Count wrote a Coping with COVID Youth Situationer at the onset of the strictest lockdowns exactly a year ago. This report is a living document divided into the mental, sexual health, civil and political rights, and socio-economic situations of young LGBTs in the Asia and the Pacific. In its cross-cutting issues, the report shows the apparent vulnerabilities of gender minorities in the core and intimate areas of reproduction, such as the politics in our bodies, our families, in the private spaces of our home, in the informal economy of beauty, sex work, and wellness spaces where most of LGBTs actually thrive. We're once again reminded by these, not behind the data and behind the statistics, that our battle as gender minorities lies within our own most intimate spaces, our right to perform our sexuality without threat and prejudice, our right to an amendment into relationships of love, justice, and acceptance with those we consider to be family, as not all biological families welcome non-heterosexual gender minorities, and microaggressions, as many panelists take on the toll of LGBTs forced with homophobic families. This is also amid the similar case of the rise of the number of gender-based violence cases committed at home and experience public space that has instead led us young LGBTs to choose family and to choose relationships was taken away with the need to stay at home to keep safe from the deadly virus. With this, I'd go briefly to our data and key recommendations and reflections from our Coping with COVID Lives of LGBTQI Youth during the lockdowns. In our survey, we have found out that primarily mental health needs takes primary among the needs of young LGBT youth and adolescents. 56% have mentioned that they needed LGBTIQ-friendly online mental health support. 48% have mentioned opportunities to help in the COVID-19 response, and 45% has mentioned the need for online learning resources. And then we asked who took our survey anyway. This was taken by 534 respondents with the support of the survey, through the support of the UNICEF. And almost half of the respondents were in the age bracket of 20 to 24 years old. The other age bracket This was followed by to the 20 to 25 to 30 years old age bracket, and then followed by the 16 to 19 years old, and then least is the 31 to 35 years old. If you were going to locate the young LGBTs who answered the surveys, where are they? Most currently live in Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. 21% came from Thailand, 21.6 rather, 21.2% from Malaysia, and 17.9% in Singapore. Among the other countries that Youth Voices kind of surveyed includes the Philippines, Vietnam, and Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos PDR, People's Republic of China, India, Myanmar, Bhutan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Korea, Hong Kong, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Brunei, Nepal, and Timor-Leste. And this survey is comprised of a diverse group of individuals. 38%, majority of it are actually female. 38.3% are female, 33.7% are male, and these are followed by non-binary and genderqueer people in 17%, and 5.2% for transgender male, 2.4% for transgender female. And for gay people, 31.5%, bisexual people, 27.4%, followed by the lesbian and intersex communities. But where do these young LGBTs get their information? We have found out in our survey that most rely on social media for information on COVID-19 and mental health. 83% get COVID-19 info from social media, while 91% obtain mental health information. And the next top sources of information are government websites and television. But if we're going to ask what's their living situation during the time of the pandemic, the survey has found out that 65.4% are actually living at home with parents. Meanwhile, 12.2% live alone, 7.9% live with their significant other, with their partner, 5.5% live with friends, roommates, 5%, 2% with other situations, and 1.5% not have, and most of young people, in most of the cases of young people, as we all know, that not all young people are capable in capable in having jobs that could actually support themselves. And meanwhile, 26.7% co-provide with other people in their homes, 20% for themselves, and 2.4% solely provide for their household. And as you can see in this demographic, there's really minimal. It's only 2% among young LGBTs who can fairly support themselves on their own. And what are the main concerns of young people right now in the Asia Pacific or LGBTs? There are two levels. The first is that their main concern really is their identity on being disclosed. And of course, the escalating hostility with family. As we all know, most of our lives right now are in isolation. But once when you're young and you're queer and you're happy to find communities in school and communities with your organizations, suddenly you're relegated back to your homophobic families, which is why it goes consistent into the data that 62% are mainly concerned with their mental health. 50% of young people are frustrated about not getting to work or study normally. A large amount is also worried about their financial situation. And of course, the social isolation on top of other issues of domestic violence, getting COVID-19, physical health stigma, and of course, the potential human rights violation. These are all the demographics of Youth Voices Count. And with these numbers, we are recommending the following. For governments, we recommend to immediately adopt measures to ensure uninterrupted access to and delivery of existing mental health services, SRHR, HIV services, Secondly, there's a need to provide quick response hotlines, in particular for LGBT youth. Thirdly, to classify community-led organizations that provide services for LGBT youth as essential workers, most especially that these community-based organizations work in young people's issues. And for donors and bilateral partners, and I think other NGOs, I that there's a need to provide flexible emergency funding for LGBTQ organizations, reallocate available funding and long-term needs of the community partners, and support governments in adopting measures. And then lastly, for LGBTs and civil society there's a need to explore multi-platform channels for LGBTQI youth, need to provide proper referral of service delivery, ensure linkage to access to justice and legal services for and to encourage collaboration and cross-movement activism with other grassroots and civil society organizations in time of health emergencies, joint initiatives, and platform building.
Rayanne, sorry.
So I'm going to end with this.
Great, thanks. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm actually ending with this. Thank you very much. On behalf of Asia Pacific, we'd like to thank once again ADB for
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rayanne. Of course, going over the whole kind of panoply of issues that have affected many young people who have, of course, been stuck at home, and if they are in hostile environments or somewhat hostile environments, then obviously there's been a really difficult time over the last year or so. So thank you very much for setting that all out so clearly. So we're running a little bit short of time now. We may just run a few minutes over, but we'll go back now to 𝗧𝗲𝗍𝗫, who you heard from in the first segment, to give her quick reactions on the sort of, things that the speakers were talking about, and how does this relate to what she's been studying over the years, and any thoughts on sort of policy priorities coming out of this. Back to you, Lee.
Great, thank you, Oliver. And first, I just want to acknowledge the amazing work that these organizations have done. It's really been heroic, I think, in responding with urgency and creativity and generosity to address these challenges. So it was very impressive work that you all have done. But I think that one of the things that really stands out is that, we knew LGBTI people were in a tough position before the pandemic, and all of this research in different countries for different groups of people really just says, that translated into particularly serious outcomes for LGBTI people in the pandemic. What do we do to come out of this? I hear, a couple of things kind of loud and clear from the research. I mean, one is that we're going to need to address issues of economic empowerment for LGBTI people coming out of the pandemic, and as it continues in different places, hitting different places at different times. So, the kinds of things that I know have been happening in many places around the world. This is part of a new research project that I'm doing, is that, organizations are also trying to provide skills for new kinds of jobs, or trying to help people improve their ability to do well on the job market by having, better resumes, better interviewing skills, learning how to access formal sector jobs. In many cases, promoting entrepreneurship is a very important path, whether that's through microfinance or mentoring or teaching business related skills. So there are things that are happening. So just as it's important to acknowledge, to figure out how to make sure LGBTI people have access to government aid and relief and healthcare services, thinking about these steps as we try to rebuild the economy are places that development banks and agencies can also be working to be sure that LGBTI people are included. And as a really important component to this, and this kind of really came through loud and clear from every study, every speaker and organization, is the importance of thinking about mental health. That the toll that minority stress takes on people in good times is hard enough, but what's been happening in the COVID era means that we're going to have to incorporate those kinds of considerations when we think about creating new programs that will help LGBTI people get back into the economy and jobs and new opportunities. So thank you for the opportunity to hear about the work that you're doing and to speak a little bit about it.
Thanks very much, Lee. I think we've just got time for one question that has been submitted, and I'll put this one to 𝗧𝗏𝗻𝗲𝗏 first. What can LGBTQ employees do when they face discrimination in the workplace? And what can employers do to ensure an LGBT-friendly environment for all employees?
Thanks for that question, but perhaps I would say that, of course, if the LGBTQ employees face discrimination in the workplace, they can, of course, seek support from this community-based organization at the country level. And also, if they know about, any platform which they can actually file a complaint, they can go ahead and do that. I would say that the community-based organization is the first platform to support them. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much, 𝗧𝗏𝗻𝗲𝗏. Rain, any specific transgender or broader thoughts on that question?
Can you repeat that question for me?
Sure, no problem whatsoever. What can LGBT employees do when they face discrimination in the workplace? And what can employers do to ensure an LGBT-friendly environment for all employees?
I agree with the earlier statement as was 𝗧𝗏𝗻𝗲𝗏 was mentioning about it's very important to have support groups. And I think community-led organizations, whether they're trans-led or specific vulnerable groups, is very important to have. So usually experiences of discrimination is very taxing to people, and it eats their mental health. That's why they need probably someone else to push for them. And for organizations or for private companies to have efforts to actually sensitize, coming from their human resources groups, to sensitize about issues concerning LGBT community. Because, for example, for trans people, one very relevant issue of discrimination is bathroom use. And it has been an issue that has been faced in many countries, even recently in the Philippines about the 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 resort. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And for organizations to be sensitized, if they do not know, then ask support or ask from the communities themselves, because trans communities or the larger community as well are experts on these fields, and they are actually more knowledgeable in this situation and should be encouraged to be involved and engage in a more meaningful way. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rain. Just reminded me while you were talking that a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, we actually had an incident with an accusation about bathroom use within ADB. And what was so impressive was that within 2 weeks, there were actually all gender bathrooms all around the building, only a couple of weeks after the incident happened. So that was good. So I think we're coming towards the end now. So thank you to our three speakers, 𝗧𝗏𝗻𝗲𝗏, Rain and Rayan. And once again, thank you to Lee. And to our audience. It was a very rich discussion, which gives us plenty of food for thought as we identify steps we can make to support 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 inclusion across the region. I will now hand over to Bruce Dunn to give closing remarks. Bruce is director of ADB's Safeguard Division, where he leads a team dedicated to ensuring the implementation of environmental and social safeguard policy principles and good practices in ADB operations. Over to you, Bruce.
Great, thank you very much, Oliver, and good day to everyone. Really great session, really fascinating. I would like to sincerely thank all of our speakers for such an interesting and informative session and their contributions. It's really great work also that all of you are doing to bring insights and attention to these issues. Now, importantly, I think what we heard today were a lot of different facets, multiple impacts of the pandemic on sexual and gender minorities, including examples of differentiated effects on transgender people, young people. And this was strongly brought out, I thought, by the representatives of the civil society on the panel. Also need to thank 𝗥𝗲𝗀𝗶𝘀𝗵𝗲𝗏 and 𝗦𝘂𝗽𝗽𝗍𝗵𝗏 for giving us the benefit of your many years of experience and the clarity with which you made the case for 𝗧cie equality, I think was just really spot on. The perspectives on basic rights and overall economic utility I thought was really fascinating. And I really appreciated, 𝗦𝘂𝗽𝗽𝗍𝗵𝗏, your thoughts on different approaches that can be taken to start conversations with people and businesses around 𝗧cie discrimination. You talked about debunking myths and also changing the dialogue. I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we approach these issues. Also, both 𝗦𝘂𝗽𝗽𝗍𝗵𝗏 and 𝗥𝗲𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 made the point about the losses to the economy from discrimination on the basis of 𝗧cie. And these can be significant. I heard 1% loss of GDP in India, 0.5% in the Philippines. But the other really crucial point that came out was, that despite the economic arguments, there is a clear human rights angle. Discrimination is wrong, and discrimination has a major impact on people's health and their long-term well-being. And so this is, should be really forefront in our minds. Also coming out of the panel discussion on the COVID crisis, which I found, really challenging to hear the effects that are impacting on people's lives. The evidence is there. The evidence for the impacts on people's rights and their mental health. There can be quite distinct impacts on different groups and for youth, ranging from increased financial impacts to marginalization, discrimination, including accessing quarantine and treatment facilities for COVID-19. I think that's particularly concerning and of interest, or should be of strong interest to us at ADB, also as we work to support governments in the region to design COVID-19 response programs, which we all know that we need to make sure that those are inclusive. So these are critical issues for us to hear about. Also the mental health challenges that youth are facing and the need for improved mental health services and targeting of information and targeting of service delivery for LGBTQI youth. Again, these are really important issues for us to consider and work through. Now, before I wrap up, I wanted to also briefly mention some of the ongoing work that we're doing. As Olivia had mentioned, I'm currently leading ADB's Safeguard Division, and this is a team that's dedicated to ensuring that our projects using ADB finance are designed in a way that protects people and the environment. And as part of this work, we're supporting knowledge work on 𝗧cie inclusion across the Asia-Pacific region, and Olivia's part of this work. This includes the study that you had mentioned earlier on legal barriers to 𝗧cie inclusion, which is going to cover 24 countries and will give us, we hope, significantly more nuanced data in terms of how to ensure our projects consider the full range of impacts on sexual and gender minorities. Now, this will help us understand also, importantly, how we can effectively prepare our projects from the perspective of both inclusion as well as risk management. Now, linked to this, we are in the process of doing an update to our 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement. And as part of this, we're going to be looking to address a range of thematic gaps and emerging issues, which includes specifically, and we've mentioned this in the approach paper, consideration of 𝗧gie inclusion issues. So this is something we need to think very carefully of. And I'm really glad that the outcomes of this event have been so useful, and it gives us really a great jumping off point for that review process. Finally, let me thank all of you here today in the audience. We've had well over 100 people joining the session, and you know, your contributions to this dialogue are really important, and we look forward to having further engagement and discussions with you as we learn from our friends from the LGBTQI community. Really helps us to understand how we can improve our projects and programs across all of Asia and the Pacific. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed the session, and back to you, Olivia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce, and thanks for such an impassioned and incisive finale to the event, and really a great summary, both of what we covered and in the sort of future directions in which we're looking to go. And once again, thank you to all our speakers. And I want to say a quick but heartfelt thank you to a few people who this event wouldn't have been possible without. Firstly, to Kate, Tony and Lainey from the team in which I sit, the NGO and Civil Society Centre, to Monching from our communications department, to our events management and IT department teams, and also to Ramil, Cole and Justin, who come from the 3 CSOs that you saw appear and who were also instrumental in making this event happen. So please stay safe and well, everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you. Goodbye.